I'm Mackenzie from the Harrisburg District Library. Today I'll be giving you a crash course in using watercolor paints. This video is perfect for absolute beginners. No experience is necessary. Today we'll talk about the paint itself and some different techniques that you can try. This video is just covering the basics, so if you'd like to learn more, let us know in the comments. Let's get started. First, let's talk about paper. Because watercolor uses so much water, using ordinary paper would be ineffective. You'll want to use a paper specifically made for watercolor paint, as it's designed to absorb the water and holds up better as you apply more paint. Watercolor paper often has a textured surface. The coarseness of paper is sometimes referred to as tooth. Paper that's more smooth has very little tooth. The rougher the paper is, the more tooth it has. The texture will show up through your paint and will create a certain look, so it's good to experiment on a scrap piece of the watercolor paper before you start your work of art. You'll also need water that may need to be replaced from time to time, and you'll also need a paper towel to dry your brushes on. If you're working with dry watercolor paint, whether it's paint you've already put in your palette, or maybe a pre-made paint palette you purchased, you have to activate the paint with water. You can add just a few drops at a time in order to control how opaque your colors become. As you can see, my yellow paint here is not very strong. This is because the paint is mostly diluted. The stronger the paint concentration is, the more vibrant the color will be. One of the advantages to using watercolor is that it's translucent enough that it can be built off of. It's also easy enough to create a gradient effect with these paints. Just add more water. We can see this demonstrated here. The more water you add, the thinner it becomes. Pay attention to your water-paint ratio and find what works for you. Now let's see how concentrated paint from a tube can be. Because it's wet, it is more soluble and mixes well with water. It's easy to use too much paint though. Keep in mind that a little goes a long way. Watercolor differs from acrylic in that way. However, it is easy to create a full value scale with such strong colors. There's several ways you can mix watercolor paint. Because it's translucent, you can layer different colors of paint to create a new color. Allow for each layer to dry before adding another layer. You can also mix colors by starting with wet paint on the page, then add a different color to it. This will cause extra wear and tear on your paper, but it creates a unique look. The most common way of mixing colors is by combining water and pigments in a paint tray or palette. This method evenly mixes your color, so when it dries on the page, it will be a smooth, consistent color. Here's some things to keep in mind when you're painting. It's okay to introduce different colors to create a new color, but in order to preserve your original colors, be sure to clean your brush before you go back to the original colors in your palette. Otherwise, they'll be tinted or potentially ruined. You can see what happens as I add my brush that's loaded with red paint to my yellow paint. Now I've got orange in with the yellow. I've already got orange in my palette, so I didn't benefit from making more. Now I'll have to use what's left of the yellow, or start with fresh yellow paint in a different spot. Fortunately, in the painting I'm making, I can adapt and use that color that results from totally mixing in the red, which gave me a golden yellow. Painting mistakes don't always work out nicely though, so pay attention when you paint. Here I've just finished painting with black paint. Cleaning your brush out after using dark pigments or highly concentrated paint can color your cleaning water. That's why it's important to regularly change out your water while you're painting. It may not seem that dirty, but notice how dingy it makes my yellow look. Yuck! Here's a neat alternative to normal watercolor painting. This is a water brush with a built-in refillable water barrel. It's easy enough to use. You simply squeeze the barrel to release water, which you can mix into your paint. The harder you squeeze, the more water is released. You can even add water as you paint, which can give a nice gradient. To clean the brush, just squeeze and wipe on a clean towel. These brushes come in a variety of sizes, so your brush strokes can vary in width, but the strokes will all typically be rounded and smooth. This technique is called wet on wet. You start with a wet surface, either a solid color or just clean water. Then load your brush with a bit of paint and watch as it feathers out when you touch that wet area. This can be useful when painting something soft and fuzzy. Just add as much paint as you need and watch it work. Next is what's called a wash. You start with a well-mixed paint and evenly paint an area. You may need to dab the excess in some spots so it dries with a nice, consistent color. This technique is often used for backgrounds. Dry brush is great for creating textures you find in nature. It's best to use an old brush you're not worried about damaging. For this technique, only add a little water to your paint, just enough so it will transfer to the paper. Experiment until you find just the right texture, and don't be afraid to brush roughly. Lifting paint is when you go back to an area that's already been painted and you use a clean wet brush or a damp tissue to remove paint. This creates an interesting cloud-like texture, but it also comes in handy for removing paint from an area you didn't mean to paint. Watercolor is a forgiving medium in that way. A fun technique for creating texture is called splattering. Load your brush with paint and tap the brush against another brush, or simply tap with your finger to create this effect. This can also be done with a toothbrush. This can be used to create the appearance of sand, dirt, or stars. You can control your splattering a little by covering an area with paper or a cutout, but regardless, keep in mind that this is a messy technique. If you're looking for clean edges, try using masking tape or painter's tape before you paint to control where it flows. After the paint has thoroughly dried, peel the tape off carefully to reveal clean, sharp lines. This is perfect for creating a border around your artwork. Keeping your tools clean is just as important as good painting techniques. Use either clean running water or a cup of clean water to clean your brushes. Don't clean them too vigorously as it can damage the brush. Also, allow them to dry in open air. Don't tuck them away somewhere cramped, or the bristles might end up crushed, drying in weird stray angles. You can wash your whole paint tray, but if you want to save some of your paint for next time, use a damp cloth to wipe out the colors you don't want to keep, and then allow the rest of the paint to dry while in storage until next time. I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe learned something new. If you'd like to see more content like this, maybe more about watercolor, let us know. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us online or in person at the library. Until next time, happy painting!